Now he, as I said in the beginning of this, he gets wounded. And at this point, he's been wounded, and now he's heading to Blighty, which we talked about this before on the podcast, but Blighty was slang for going back to England. Back to the book. Never in all my fortnight's journey to Blighty did I hear a word of self-pity or complaining. So he's going with a bunch of wounded people. He's not hearing any complaining. On the contrary, the most severely wounded men would profess themselves grateful that they had gotten off so lightly. Since the war started, the term lightly has become exceedingly comparative. I suppose a man is justified in saying he's got off lightly when what he expected was death. I remember a big Highland officer who'd been shot in the kneecap. He'd been operated on, and the kneecap had been found to be so splintered it had to be removed. Of this, he was unaware. For the first day as he lay in bed, he kept wondering aloud how long it would be before he could rejoin his battalion. Perhaps he suspected his condition and was trying to find out. All his heart seemed set at once on getting back into the fighting. Next morning, he plucked up the courage to ask the doctor and received the answer he had dreaded. Never. You won't be going back, old chap. Next time he spoke, his voice was a bit throaty. Will it stiffen? You've lost the knee joint, the doctor said, but with luck, we'll save the leg. His voice sank to a whisper. If you do, it won't be much good, will it? Not much, said the doctor. He lay for a couple hours silent, readjusting his mind to meet the new conditions. Then he commenced talking with cheerfulness about returning to his family. The habit of courage had conquered, the habit of courage which grows out of the knowledge that you let your pals down by showing cowardice. So, took him a couple hours to adjust. Said, okay, looks like I get to go back to my family. Now we have another type of casualty here, talking about men that have had major disfigurements to their faces. And they would wrap their whole faces up. Back to the book. In these days that followed, I saw several of these masked men. The worst cases were not allowed to walk about. The ones I saw were invariably dressed with the most scrupulous care in the smartest uniforms. Sam Brown's, that's the belt that goes over your shoulder, polished buttons, shining. They had hope and took a pride in themselves, a splendid sign. Perhaps you ask why the face cases should be kept in France. So the guys that had major facial disfigurement, they would stay in France. I was not told, but I can guess, because they dread going back to England to their girls until they had got rid of their disfigurements. So for 2 years, through their bandages, they watched the train pull out for Blighty, while the damage which was done to them in a fragment of a second is repaired. At a base hospital, you see something which you don't see at casualty stations. Sisters, mothers, sweethearts, and wives sitting beside the beds. They're allowed to come over from England when their man is dying. One of the wonderful things to me was to observe how these women in the hour of their tragedy catch this soldier spirit. They're very quiet, very cheerful, very helpful. While passing through the ward, they get to know some of the other patients and remember them when they bring their own man flowers. Sometimes when their own man is asleep, they slip over to other bedsides and do something kind for the solitary fellows. That's the army all over. Military discipline is based on unselfishness. These women who have been sent to see their men die catch from them the spirit of undistressed sacrifice and enroll themselves as soldiers. You discover the spirit of the man when you've heard him wandering in delirium. So he's talking a little bit about the, obviously, guys that are suffering from shell shock is what they call it, what they used to call it in World War I. Guys that are having some mental issues. All night in the shadowy ward with its hooded lamps, he would be giving orders for the comfort of his men. Sometimes he'd be proposing to go forward himself to a place where a company was having a hot time. Apparently, one of his officers was trying to dissuade him. "Danger be damned," he'd exclaim in a wonderfully strong voice. "It'll buck 'em up to see me. Splendid chaps. Splendid chaps." For the soldier, it seems that the war has always been, and that they will never cease to being soldiers. For them, both the past and the future are utterly obliterated. They would not have it otherwise. Because they are doing their duty, they are contented. The only time the subject is ever touched on is when someone expresses the hope that it'll last long enough for them to recover from his wounds and get back to the line. That usually starts another man who will never be any more good for the trenches, wondering whether he can get into the flying corps. The one ultimate hope of all these shattered wrecks who are being hurried to Blighty, they have dreamt of, is that they may see service again. And we still hear that. We still hear that to this day. We still hear that. And I heard that. You know, I talked about hearing that from Ryan Job, who was blind, and he's back in America, and he's like, "Let me come back." My first guy that I ever had get wounded bad, and I went to see him in the medical outstation, and I just went down to like shake his hand, and he was on morphine. You know, he'd been shot in the leg. He didn't know if he was going to lose his leg or not. And like I went down and gave, you know, I like went to shake his hand, and he pulled me in, and he's like, "Let me stay." And I was just like, "You man, what an awesome brother right there." So this is not rare. This still happens, and you know, you hear this all the time. And you know what? There's guys in the U.S. military that go back to combat with, you know, one leg, with one hand. I mean, even Jody was like talking about, you know, when he woke up and found Jody Middick, who we did the podcast with, when he woke up and he found out that they took both of his legs, he was pissed because one leg you can still go back on deployment, but two legs you can't do it. So Jody, the badass, was just like, "No, look, how am I going to go back now?"
Yeah.